But speaking of superstars, Jason Anik, the Patriots need one. And I would like to lead us through a little exercise, a T. Higgins related would you rather for the Patriots? Because I think as you and I have talked about, it's going to be a steep number to get T. Higgins. We're talking somewhere between probably $30 and $32 million a year on average, right? So I just went with 30 as a landing spot. So, Jay, would you rather spend $30 million on T. Higgins or $30 million getting Chris Godwin and Mike Williams?
In that particular question, I would say T. Higgins without question, because I'm not that interested in Chris Godwin and Mike Williams. Chris Godwin just gives me hesitancy. We could have a conversation, Cooper Kupp versus Chris Godwin. I think that could be a very interesting conversation, but none of them are as a number one receiver. But if I'm being honest with you, Gresh, like T. Higgins, I don't think he's going anywhere, whether it's the franchise this year, next year.
Wow, really?
I don't. I think they are going. I don't think it's all just smoke. I think for them talking about wanting to retain all these guys, maybe Trey Hendrickson's the guy that gets moved on. But I think at least another year, T. Higgins is staying in Cincinnati. I just think that they want enough. He wants to be there. They want him there. His quarterback wants him there. So it's hard for me to get excited about T. Higgins. And I will say, I said this on last week's show, after watching what the Philadelphia Eagles did in the Super Bowl and in the postseason and during the regular season, my interest in T. Higgins, while it remains high, has paled a little bit. I'm much more interested in them building out this roster in the trenches than I am going to. Now, if they want to go get T. Higgins, don't get me wrong. I think that could elevate your roster, but I don't think he wants to go anywhere. So for me, I would pick him over Mike Williams and Chris Godwin.
Wow, interesting, because that's why I think this exercise sort of works, because it sort of makes you realize how far are you willing to go, or if in the event of what you say, Jay, if T. Higgins goes nowhere and stays in Cincinnati, then it's kind of like, all right, well, what are the options? Let me jump to one of the would you rathers then with an offensive lineman in it, right? So would you rather $30 million on T. Higgins or $30 million on Ronnie Stanley, the left tackle from Baltimore, and tight end from New Orleans, Juwan Johnson?
Ronnie Stanley and Juwan Johnson.
Yeah, now isn't that an interesting pivot? Only because I know you think T. Higgins is going nowhere, but I do think even in that question, spending $30 million on a guy that could be your starting left tackle and at worst your number 2 tight end, you think about that upgrade in the offense, and you just bring in a marginally good wide receiver, you would think the tide's going to raise a little bit.
I agree. And given how many holes there are across this whole roster, I guess in my mind, T. Higgins just doesn't solve every problem that there is to be solved. So I think there's a lot he's going to demand. So, I mean, Jamar Chase is probably about to get as big a contract a wide receiver has ever seen. And if if Higgins is not going to be there with him, you can be sure he could demand something pretty close to that. So for me, I think that the team that takes T. Higgins could be suffering in other parts. And so for me at this stage, right, I become less interested in T. Higgins to the Patriots every day.
All right, I have another tackle, running back, wide receiver combo to throw at you. But just in terms of wide receiver choice, right? Say Higgins does get free. $30 million on T. Higgins or $30 million on Steph Diggs and Keenan Allen in a short-term run?
I'm not interested in Stephon Diggs or Keenan Allen at this stage. I've talked a lot about Drake Maye being 22. Both those guys are, I think, over 30. Yes, Keenan Allen certainly, and I think even Diggs is 30, 31. No, thank you. I will take T. Higgins all day over those two.
Yeah, you know what? That's one where I would. That's one where I would probably spend on Higgins. On the first one with Godwin and Williams, man, oh man, if you start to think about how the pieces would kind of fit with those two guys coming in, and then the smaller receivers that you already have, being able to work over the middle of the field, to me, that one is enticing. Here's one, because I really did. I thought the T. Higgins piece of this would be a little more intriguing. So would you rather $30 million on T. Higgins or $30 million on Cam Robinson to play left tackle, Amari Cooper as a depth wide receiver, and a flyer on Nick Chubb?
Cam Robinson, Nick Chubb. I mean, Amari Cooper, I guess just take and hope maybe something happens there as the third piece. But yeah, and I think Nick Chubb has some things to prove. You know, when they took Sony Michel, did Nick Chubb go the pick before him or a couple picks after Sony
it was
Michel?
After, yeah.
Right. So I would love to see him in a Patriots uniform. So yeah, but I think anytime you give me a high level lineman, I really believe that is such a huge need for Drake Maye. I've talked about worrying about the concussion. So protecting him, I think, is paramount. So yeah, any of these sort of would you rather that have a big boy in it, I probably would lean that way. But let me ask you about T. Higgins. Mm-hmm. Do you expect him to be in a Cincinnati Bengals uniform under the franchise tag in 2025?
I kind of do, because it would make sense for them to franchise again. I don't know if there was language put in to where they couldn't do it a second year. A lot of agents will try to get that as almost like the make good for getting it guaranteed. I think it was for Higgins, $26.5 million this year. My gut tells me Cincinnati will figure it out, but here's the hope. If there is a team that would screw it up, it would be Cincinnati. They would be the one who would be penny wise, pound foolish, and end up, losing or at least exposing a guy like Higgins. I think, Jay, if anything, they might franchise tag him. If anything, just to be able to work out a trade with someone, because even his number on the franchise tag, be around what he would get in free agency. He'd probably end up getting a little bit more in terms of guarantee. So I do think the money does play into it, but I think it's 50-50 on Higgins staying there, because Mike Brown is a proven idiot and they're cheap.
Well, and if you bring it back to the baseball conversation about Rafael Devers, right? And how many of these guys, or even the NBA conversation, Anthony Edwards, what does T. Higgins want to be? Because you will always be the number 2 wide receiver in Cincinnati, regardless of what your pay stub says every 2 weeks, so maybe he does want more there, but I don't get the sense, right? I think he's pretty comfortable. I think he knows how good he is and maybe doesn't necessarily need to make that jump. And I do believe that combination, if you're able to keep Burrow, Higgins, and Chase together, I think got a great chance at some point to find a way to hoist a trophy.
Now, one of the last would you rathers I threw in was T. Higgins or someone else, and I'll just leave the T. Higgins part of it out of it. Would you entertain Davante Adams for a 3rd round pick? He's due $35 million, but you would be able to sort of reset his contract a little bit. Good citizen, only has 2 years on his deal. Maybe you'd have to give him a 3rd. Is that someone you would entertain to be able to come in right away and be a top level wide receiver-ish?
Without question. I love everything about that guy. And I think there are going to be certain players that are going to be able to perform better into their 30s. And he may be one of them, whereas I don't think Cooper Kupp is necessarily going to be one. So I would be all about that. But it's interesting. Davante Adams, some rumblings that he's looking at the Chargers, right? Joe Burrow. And Ladd McConkey, who the Patriots got out of that slot, right? So if I'm Davante Adams, I see, look at all the attention that this guy, Ladd McConkey, is going to take from these defenses, and I'm going to work my magic on the outside. So I do think for some of these, and maybe that's part of T. Higgins thinking, right, too, where look at all these opportunities with Jamar Chase on the other side. So I think the Patriots are not quite, I think there's a lot of sort of excitement with Drake Maye, but I don't see a guy like Davante Adams wanting to make that move at this stage of his career. And I absolutely still believe the Patriots are a year away. And maybe that's some of the T. Higgins thing. Let him play Cincinnati one more year and then go get him. But I think this is sort of, gosh, I don't like these terms, retool, rebuild. This is a rebuilding year, if there ever was a building year for this New England Patriots club. So I wouldn't mind them holding off on a crazy splash this year and building toward it maybe next year.
Yeah, I almost feel like I'm warming up to the idea of a veteran who is Adams-like, who might be a little bit older, but does the right things, works hard, has been a decent citizen, all that kind of stuff. Good locker room guy. If you looked at Davante Adams and you got him to $25 million this year, but you're only going to have him for a couple of years, then it allows you to go get the next big thing in a couple of seasons if you want to, while trying to develop the guys underneath. And look, as much as we all love Kendrick Bourne, that wide receiver group is really young. You kind of need a stud in there, maybe with a little bit of veteran wisdom, who could come in and sort of show them the way.
Yeah, it's interesting. Davante Adams is a 1, right? And if we talk about Godwin and Kupp, you don't look at either one of those as a 1. Do you?
No, Godwin would be a really nice upgrade and would be kind of the de facto number 1 here. Yep. But you couldn't use him as just the straight up outside Z wide receiver.
I agree. And I would prefer Godwin, I think, to Cup at this stage because I trust McVay. And look, that organization has been trying to get rid of Cooper Kupp now for 6-8 months, it feels like. So I trust that. Godwin coming off the injury, I don't know, but I agree, right? That sort of go-to guy to be there. We talked a lot about Kelsey being unable to be that go-to guy. And we talked about that. Gosh, I know we do this show weekly, but man, all the stuff that came out about Kelsey after we talked about on this show, him being disinterested without some of those clips. But I do believe that Godwin could be that sort of constant guy to go to sort of get open and be a good third down target, etc. But ultimately, I want that big splash. And Cody puts in the chat, right? Hunter could be walking through that door potentially too. So whoever else you bring in addition to him, that could be interesting.
Yeah, and the Travis Hunter thing, boy, you put Christian Gonzalez and Travis Hunter as your starting corners, and let's say you end up signing Chris Godwin, Ronnie Stanley, maybe you throw a tight end in there. You take a short-term flyer contract on Nick Chubb, who's been dinged up the last couple of years. And it becomes one of those deals, Jay, where if all of those guys hit, then you maybe jump to an 11-win team. But if not, and they're just kind of themselves, it gets you back to par.
I tell you what, Christian Gonzalez and some of the media he's done, give me all of it. He's become, I see him sort of becoming a little bit more. He is. And you see that vocal leader coming out. And I think that second team all-pro selection has sort of opened up Pandora's box a little bit with his sort of willingness to be a vocal leader. Every time someone wants to talk about Drake Maye on the offense, he's like, well, I'm leading this defense. I can't get enough of this kid. I think there are a lot of people around the league. Certainly him being elected second team all-pro tells you everything you need to know. He was banged up his rookie year, but a lot of people don't know quite how good this kid is.
And I know that the number one pick market is kind of fluctuating all over the place. I know we mentioned Travis Hunter. By the way, the only guy who was a Patriot that was on the all Belichick team was Christian Gonzalez.